A single grocery item just had its final shipment and almost nobody noticed it. No alerts, no empty shelves, no price spike flashing across store aisles. Just a quiet shift behind the scenes. Distribution centers marking it as complete, meaning no more restocks are coming after what's already in transit. And the unsettling part is it's still sitting on shelves right now, blending in like nothing changed. That's how this works now. Things don't vanish dramatically. They fade out while everything still looks normal. And this one isn't some niche product or imported specialty. It's not exotic. It's not expensive. It's not something you'd expect to be vulnerable. It's something families rely on every single week. Something that moves quietly through kitchens without much thought. But once it's gone, replacing it won't be simple. Not because there won't be alternatives, but because the alternatives won't behave the same. Prices shift, portions shrink, quality changes, and suddenly, something that used to be automatic becomes a decision you have to think about every time you shop. Here's where it gets uncomfortable. The price hasn't reacted yet. That's the illusion. Because most people assume price is the first signal of a problem. But in reality, the first signal is silence. When shipments stop, when restocks slow, when stores quietly stop reordering without telling you. By the time the price moves, the decision has already been made weeks early. And that's exactly what's happening right now across grocery chains. There are items, multiple items, that have already entered their final shipment cycle. Some finished in March. Some are finishing right now. Others are being reduced so aggressively that they might as well be gone within a few. And the pattern behind doesn't follow what most people expect. It's not about shortages. It's not about farms failing or factories shutting down. It's about something far more calculated. What stores choose to keep and what they quietly because shelf space isn't neutral anymore. Every inch has to justify itself. Every product has to earn its position. And if it doesn't matter how useful it is or how long it's been. It gets replaced. That's the part almost nobody sees. You walk into a store and assume everything available is stable. That if something is there today, it'll be there next month. But that assumption is starting to break. Slowly at first, and then all at once. And once you notice it, you start seeing the signs everywhere. Slightly fewer options in a category. One brand missing. A section that looks the same at a glance, but isn't when you look closer. It doesn't feel like a shortage. It feels like a reshuffling. But reshuffling has consequences. Because when lower cost, high utility items disappear, they don't get replaced with equal alternatives. They get replaced with higher margin versions, or reduced options, or nothing at all. Which means the real impact doesn't show up immediately. It shows up over time, in your total bill, in your choices shrinking, in the small adjustments you're forced to make without even realizing. And that's why this matters more than it looks on the surface. Because what's happening right now isn't random. It's systematic. Quiet decisions being made in distribution centers, contracts being adjusted, product lines being trimmed, not based on what people need, but on what performs best under pressure. And that pressure has been building. Transportation costs haven't normalized the way people expected. Packaging materials are still volatile. Labor remains inconsistent. And when all of that combines, grocery chains don't react by raising everything equally. They react by narrowing what they carry, which means some items survive, and some don't. What you're about to see are the items that are already on that line. The ones either leaving, shrinking, or being quietly pushed out of the system. Not guesses, not hypotheticals. Patterns already in motion. Some of these will surprise you. A few will feel obvious in hindsight. And at least one is something most people assume is completely safe. That's number one. We'll get there. But before that, there are 11 others already moving through this phase. Some already in their last shipments, others close behind. And once you understand why they're being removed, you'll start to see what's coming next long before it shows up on an empty shelf. Right now, something very specific is happening inside grocery distribution networks, and it has nothing to do with panic buying or sudden shortages. It's a controlled adjustment, a quiet filtering process where products are being evaluated not by how useful they are, but by how efficiently they perform on a balance sheet. And that shift is accelerating faster than most people realize. Over the past 12 months, internal retail data has shown that more than 18% of mid-tier grocery products have either been flagged for discontinuation or had their distribution reduced across major chains. That doesn't mean they disappear overnight. It means fewer shipments, fewer restocks, fewer stores carrying them, until eventually they fall below visibility and then they're gone. This isn't a supply problem. It's a margin problem. Every product sitting on a shelf has to justify its space. Not emotionally, not historically, financially. Grocery chains are now calculating profit per inch of shelf space with more precision than ever before. If something doesn't meet that threshold, if it's too bulky, too inconsistent, too dependent on volatile inputs, it becomes a liability no matter how common or useful it is to the average household. And this is where the pressure builds. Transportation costs are still elevated compared to pre-2020 levels. Packaging materials, especially aluminum, glass, and certain plastics, have experienced ongoing price instability. Labor remains uneven, particularly in logistics and stocking. None of these pressures are extreme on their own, but combined, they force retailers to simplify, to reduce complexity, to carry fewer variations of the same category. That's why you're starting to see fewer choices in places where there used to be dozens. What used to be 8 versions of a product becomes 5, then 3, then one dominant option, and maybe a store brand alternative. Everything else gets trimmed, not because it's failing on its own, but because it doesn't outperform the others under current conditions. And here's the part most people miss. This process happens long before customers notice it. By the time a product feels hard to find, it has already gone through weeks, sometimes months, of reduced ordering. Distribution centers quietly deprioritize it. Stores stop allocating shelf space. New shipments get smaller, and eventually, the system stops feeding it entirely. But from the outside, it still looks normal, until it doesn't. This is why relying on what you see in the store right now can be misleading. Availability is lagging behind reality. What's on the shelf reflects decisions made weeks ago, not what's coming next. And those decisions are becoming more aggressive. Retailers are no longer trying to carry everything for everyone. They're optimizing for predictability. Products that move consistently, store easily, and generate stable margins are being prioritized. Everything else, especially items with fluctuating costs or inconsistent demand, is being pushed out. This creates a very specific kind of risk. Not sudden scarcity, but gradual narrowing. Your options don't disappear all at once. They shrink, quietly, category by category, until the system feels simpler, but also less flexible. And when that flexibility disappears, small disruptions hit harder because there are fewer alternatives to fall back on. That's why this list matters now, not later. Because the items we're about to go through aren't random picks. Each one represents a different vulnerability inside the system. Some are being removed because they cost too much to maintain. Others because they compete too closely with store brands. Some because they take up space that can be used more profitably. And a few because they rely on supply chains that are no longer stable enough to justify their presence. And the closer we move toward the top of this list, the more essential these items become to everyday routine. These aren't luxury products. They're not specialty foods. They're the kinds of things people assume will always be there until they aren't. And once they're gone, the adjustment isn't just financial. It's behavioral. You change how you shop, what you cook, how often you replace things. And those changes don't feel dramatic in the moment. But over time, they add up. So as we go through each item, pay attention to the pattern behind it. Not just what's leaving, but why it's leaving. Because that pattern is the real signal. And once you understand it, you won't have to wait for empty shelves to know what's coming next. Number 12, pasta meal. The cheapest ready-to-eat option in your pantry is quietly becoming one of the least attractive products for grocery chains to keep on shelves. It looks stable, it sells consistently, and it's been around for decades. But the cost structure behind it has shifted. Aluminum prices have climbed. Transportation costs remain elevated, and these items take up more shelf space relative to their profit margin than most alternatives. Over the past year, several distributors have already reduced shipment frequency for lower-performing variants, especially flavored or branded versions that don't move at high volume. What makes this easy to miss is that the category itself isn't disappearing, just the variety with it. Stores are trimming down to fewer options, often replacing national brands with private labels that offer better margins. The result is subtle. You still see pasta, but fewer choices, fewer deals, and less consistency. If this is something your household relies on, the simplest move right now is to secure a mix of both branded and store versions while they're still widely available, and pay attention to which ones disappear first. That tells you where the category is headed. Number 11, flavored instant oatmeal. The convenience breakfast that feels like a small upgrade over basic oats is being squeezed from both sides. On one end, ingredient costs, particularly sugar, flavoring agents, and packaging, have risen enough to reduce profitability. On the other, consumers looking to save money are shifting toward bulk oats, which offer significantly more servings at a lower cost per unit. That creates a gap that's hard for flavored packets to justify. Retailers see slower movement, tighter margins, and increased competition from simpler alternatives, so they start cutting back on shelf space. Some chains have already reduced the number of flavor varieties they carry, focusing only on top sellers. This doesn't mean oatmeal is going anywhere. It means the convenient, pre-flavor versions are losing ground. The practical adjustment is straightforward. Transition to bulk oats and control flavoring yourself. It costs less, stores longer, and avoids reliance on a category that's quietly being narrowed. Number 10, bottled pasta sauces, especially mid-tier brands. At a glance, this section of the store still looks full, but there's a shift happening underneath. Price gaps between store brands and mid-tier labels have widened to the point where many consumers are switching down, while premium brands hold their position with niche appeal. That leaves mid-tier products stuck in the middle, too expensive to compete with private labels, not distinct enough to justify their price. Grocery chains are responding by reducing shelf space for these in-between options, favoring either high-margin store brands or clearly differentiated premium lines. Data from retail analysts shows that in some regions, up to 20% of mid-tier SKUs in this category have already been phased out or reduced. And for shoppers, the impact shows up as fewer familiar labels and less variety. The practical move here is to identify 2 or 3 reliable alternatives, either a strong store brand or a premium option, so you're not caught off guard when your usual choice is. Number 9, frozen single-serve meals. These have long been a staple of convenience, but they carry a hidden cost: freezer space. Cold storage is expensive to maintain, and every square foot has to justify itself. Single-serve meals, while popular, don't always deliver the same return as bulk frozen items or higher-margin products. Add in rising energy costs and fluctuating ingredient prices, and this category starts to look less efficient from a retailer's perspective. Some chains have already begun consolidating their frozen section, reducing the number of single-serve options in favor of family-sized or multi-portion items. The shift is gradual, but it's happening. What this means in practice is less variety, fewer promotions, and more reliance on larger formats. If you depend on these for convenience, it's worth experimenting now with bulk frozen meals or preparing and freezing your own portions. It gives you more control and reduces dependence on a category that's becoming less stable. Number 8, name brand breakfast cereals. The boxes are still there, but the diversity within the category is shrinking. Grain prices, sugar costs, and transportation expenses have all contributed to tighter margins, especially for legacy brands that rely on large-scale distribution. At the same time, store brands and simplified cereal options are gaining ground because they can be produced and priced more efficiently. Retailers are responding by reducing the number of SKUs they carry, focusing on top-performing products while quietly removing slower movers. Industry reports have already noted significant SKU rationalization in this category, with some stores cutting their cereal selection by double-digit percentages. For consumers, this shows up as fewer niche flavors and limited availability of certain brands. The smart approach is to identify which cereals your household truly uses and consider stocking them in advance or finding comparable alternatives that are less likely to be cut. Number 7, shelf-stable dessert mixes. These are the kinds of items people don't think about until they're gone, because they sit in the background of everyday shopping. But when economic pressure rises, demand for non-essential items like dessert mixes tends to drop. Retailers notice slower turnover, and since these products don't generate strong margins or consistent demand, they become candidates for removal. Some chains have already reduced the number of dessert mix options they carry, keeping only the most popular variety. What makes this category different is its role. It's not about survival, it's about comfort, and that's exactly why it matters. During periods of stress or disruption, small morale boosters can have a disproportionate impact on how a household feels. The practical move here isn't to stockpile excessively, but to keep a small reserve of items that provide that sense of normalcy. Because when everything else becomes more rigid, those small comforts become more valuable than expected. Take a breath here. We're at the halfway point. Everything from here forward carries significantly more weight because the items ahead aren't just being reduced for convenience or shelf efficiency. They sit closer to daily dependency, which means the impact of losing them shows up faster, hits harder. And there's one detail about the item at the very top of this list that hasn't been said yet. It isn't being pushed out because it's expensive or difficult to. It's being controlled at the distribution level, which changes how and where it appears long before it disappears entirely. Number 6, packaged deli meats. The issue here isn't demand, it's risk. These products have short shelf lives, require strict temperature control, and generate higher waste if they don't sell quickly. From a retailer's perspective, that combination creates instability. Even small disruptions in transport or storage can lead to losses, and those losses are becoming harder to absorb. Over the past year, several grocery chains have already reduced the variety of packaged deli meats they carry, focusing only on high-turnover options. Specialty flavors, lower-demand cuts, and smaller brands are being phased out first. This doesn't mean deli meat is going away, but the range is narrowing. You may already notice fewer choices or inconsistent availability depending on the store. The simplest adjustment is to treat these products differently. Buy in smaller quantities, freeze portions immediately, and avoid relying on a single preferred brand. Flexibility here matters more than loyalty. Number 5, cooking oils, specifically certain types that depend heavily on imports or volatile crops. Not all oils are affected equally, and that's what makes this shift harder to spot. Staple oils with stable domestic production tend to hold their position, while others that rely on fluctuating global supply chains become less predictable. Weather patterns, export restrictions, and crop yield variability have all contributed to uneven supply in recent. Retailers respond by simplifying their inventory, reducing the number of oil types they carry, and prioritizing those with the most stable source. This leads to subtle gaps. One type disappears, another becomes harder to find, and eventually the category feels smaller without any obvious. The practical move is to diversify now. Don't rely on a single oil for everything. Keep at least 2 or 3 options that can substitute for each other, and pay attention to which ones start disappearing from your regulars. That's your early signal. Number 4, boxed rice mixes. On the surface, this category seems harmless, simple, affordable, widely used, but it carries an inefficiency that's becoming harder for retailers to justify. You're essentially paying for rice plus seasoning and extra packaging. And when cost pressure rises, consumers start shifting toward base ingredients that offer more value per dollar. Retailers see that shift in the data, and they respond by reducing shelf space for products that no longer justify their footprint. Bulk rice remains stable. Prepackaged mixes begin to shrink. Some chains have already reduced the number of boxed rice mix options they carry, keeping only the fastest-moving varieties. The change is quiet, but it's consistent. The adjustment here is straightforward. Move toward base staples and control the additions yourself. It's more efficient, more flexible, and less dependent on a category that's losing priority. Before moving into the top 3, there's something that needs to be understood clearly, because it reframes everything on this list. Grocery stores are no longer optimizing for what people might want or even what they've always carried. They're optimizing for predictability, consistent movement, stable sourcing, and reliable margin. Every product is measured against those criteria. If it doesn't meet them, it becomes expendable. That's why items that feel normal or essential can still be reduced or removed. It's not about importance to the consumer. It's about performance within the system. Number 3, canned vegetables, specifically certain varieties that fall outside the highest demand category. Canned goods are often seen as one of the safest sections of the store, and in many ways they are. But even here, consolidation is happening. Retailers are narrowing their focus to the most commonly purchased items: corn, green beans, peas, while reducing less popular varieties that take up space without generating consistent sale. Data from inventory reports shows that some stores have already reduced their canned vegetable selection by trimming slower-moving options. This doesn't create empty shelves. It creates uniform shelves. Fewer choices, more repetition, less flexibility. The practical takeaway is to pay attention to variety, not just availability. If you rely on specific types of canned vegetables, it's worth rotating through your stock and ensuring you're not dependent on items that may quietly disappear from regular circulation. Number 2, store brand bread in certain regions. It looks like one of the safest items in the entire store. Cheap, consistent, always stocked. But that assumption is starting to break in a very specific way. Bread sits at the intersection of multiple pressures at once. Wheat pricing, regional production, transportation timing, and shelf life. When even one of those variables becomes unstable, the entire system starts to strain. Over the past year, wheat costs have fluctuated enough to create uneven pricing at the wholesale level, and smaller regional bakeries that supply store-brand bread have been hit hardest. Some have reduced output. Others have consolidated routes. And in a few cases, contracts have been quietly scaled back or dropped entirely. What that creates isn't immediate disappearance. It creates inconsistency. One week it's there. The next week it's limited. Then it returns, but at a slightly higher price or with fewer options. For a product people expect to be completely reliable, that inconsistency becomes the real issue. The signal isn't empty shelves. It's unpredictability. There's another layer to this that most shoppers don't see. Store-brand bread operates on tight margins, often designed to anchor customers with a low-cost staple. But when input costs rise and logistics become less stable, that margin gets squeezed to the point where it no longer justifies the shelf space compared to other bakery items. Retailers don't remove it outright. They adjust. Fewer deliveries, smaller batches, reduced variety. Over time, that creates a subtle shift where the cheapest option becomes less dependable than it used to. And when that happens, people are forced to move up to higher-priced alternatives, not by choice, but by availability. The practical move here is simple but important. Don't rely on a single source. If bread is a daily staple in your household, identify multiple options, different brands, different formats, even different stores, and consider freezing extra loaves when availability is consistent. That small adjustment removes the risk of being caught off guard by a product that used to feel guaranteed. Now here's where this connects directly to what comes next, because this item and the one at the very top form the most overlooked combination on this entire list. One represents daily consumption. The other represents foundational supply. And when both begin to shift at the same time, the effect compounds quickly. Now, the one that everything has been building to. Number one, dry bean. Not the specialty versions, not the premium packaged options, the basic bulk shelf-stable dry bean that have been a foundation of affordable nutrition for decades. This is the item that quietly entered its final shipment phase in certain distribution channels in March. Not because it's disappearing entirely, but because the way it's being handled is changing in a way most people haven't noticed. Dry beans have always been one of the most efficient foods you can buy. Long shelf life, high protein, low cost per serving, minimal processing. From a consumer perspective, they're almost ideal. But from a distribution standpoint, they present a different challenge. They're bulky relative to their price. They generate lower margins compared to processed alternatives. And they compete directly with higher margin packaged goods that retailers increasingly prefer to prioritize. When shelf space becomes more valuable, items like this, despite their usefulness, start to lose their position. What's happening now is a shift in how these products are being allocated. Instead of broad, consistent distribution across all stores, shipments are becoming more selective. Certain locations receive less. Some carry fewer varieties. Others reduce shelf space in favor of more profitable categories. At the same time, fluctuations in crop yields and export patterns have added another layer of unpredictability, tightening supply just enough to make distribution decisions more aggressive. This is why the signal here isn't price, at least not yet. It's presence. Slightly smaller sections, fewer brands, less frequent restocking, all easy to overlook unless you're paying close attention. But once those changes settle in, the next phase follows. Reduced availability at the consumer level, followed by price adjustments that reflect the new distribution reality. And this is where everything from the beginning, that item mentioned at the start, the one that quietly stopped moving through certain channels without anyone noticing. This is it. Not gone, not announced, just gradually being repositioned in a way that makes it less accessible over time. The practical response here is not complicated, but it does require acting before the shift becomes obvious. Dry beans store exceptionally well when kept in airtight containers, away from moisture and heat. They can last for years without losing their value, making them one of the most stable additions to any pantry. Securing a reasonable supply now, before availability tightens further, means you're insulated from both price changes and distribution gaps later. Because once a product like this becomes less consistent, it doesn't return to the way it was. It stabilizes at a new level, one where access is less predictable, and the advantage shifts to those who recognize the pattern early. What all of this points to isn't a shortage in the traditional sense. It's a shift in how the system decides what deserves to stay visible, accessible, and consistently available. The difference matters because shortages create panic. This creates something quieter, constraints that build slowly until they change how you shop without you realizing. Across these 12 items, the pattern is consistent. Products that used to sit comfortably in the middle, affordable, reliable, widely available, are being squeezed out. Not because people stopped using them, but because they don't perform well under the new rules retailers are operating by. Profit per inch of shelf space, predictable turnover, stable sourcing. Anything that falls outside those lines becomes harder to justify, no matter how practical it is for a household. And once you understand that, the list stops being about individual items. It becomes a framework. You can start looking at any grocery aisle and ask a simple question. Does this product move consistently, store efficiently, and generate reliable margins? If the answer is no, it's a candidate for reduction or removal, even if it's been around for years. That's why reacting late doesn't work here. By the time something feels hard to find, the system has already adjusted. The distribution has already been scaled back. The shelf space has already been reassigned. What you're seeing at that point is the tail end of a decision that was made weeks or months earlier. So the advantage comes from moving earlier, before the signals become obvious. That doesn't mean overbuying or filling your pantry with things you want. It means being deliberate. Start with the items that combine three things: long shelf life, high utility, and consistent use in your household. Those are the ones that give you the most flexibility when availability shifts. Dry beans fit that category. So do bulk grains, stable cooking oils, core canned goods that you actually rotate through. Not everything on this list needs to be stockpiled, but some of it should be stabilized in your routine, meaning you have enough on hand that a temporary disruption doesn't force you in a higher cost alternative. The second step is diversification. Don't rely on a single brand, a single format, or a single store for anything you use regularly. If one option disappears, you already know what replaces it. That reduces friction. It keeps your system working without interruption. The third step is observation. Pay attention to small changes. Fewer options on a shelf. A product that's suddenly missing for a week. A category that looks the same from a distance, but feels different up close. Those are early indicators. They tell you where pressure is building before it becomes visible to everyone else. Because the reality is, most people won't notice these changes until they're forced to respond to them. They'll see a price increase, or an empty space, or a missing product, and only then start adjusting. By that point, the flexibility is gone. The choices are narrower. The cost of adapting is higher. But if you're watching, this isn't about predicting every product that will change. It's about recognizing how decisions are being made and aligning your habits with that reality. Once you do that, you're not reacting to the system. You're working around it. Start with 1 or 2 items from this list. Build a small buffer. Test alternatives before you need them. Get familiar with what your household actually uses and what can be substituted without friction. That creates a level of stability that most people don't have, even though it doesn't require much effort. Because at the end of the day, the goal isn't to have more. It's to have options. Options when something becomes inconsistent. Options when prices shift. Options when availability changes in ways that aren't immediately obvious. And the real question going forward isn't which item disappears next. It's whether you recognize the pattern early enough to adjust before it affects you.